for questions for YouTube. So let's begin. Tonight we welcome journalist Luke Epplin. Luke's writing has appeared online in The Atlantic, The New Yorker, GQ, Slate, Salon, The Daily Beast, and the Paris Review Daily. He's written a number of articles, including one that I found very touching about Charles Schulz's last words to his mother. He was born and raised in rural Illinois. Luke now lives in New York City, but he's joining us. Welcome, Luke.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So tonight we're going to talk about his book, Our Team, the epic story of four men in the World Series that changed baseball. If you'll allow me to digress a little, I wanted to share a little story about Mr. Feller himself. Years ago, I wrote a short story and wrote to Mr. Feller via his museum in Van Meter, Iowa. And instead of sending this form letter back, he sent this program. I guess it's a reproduction, but it is autographed by Bob Feller. And it was a barnstorming tour that was done with Satchel Paige, Stan Musial, Buck O'Neill, Phil Rizzuto. I can't name them all, but it was an incredible time, which I would have loved to have gone in 1946. I'll show you one more photo of Satchel and then we'll begin. Let's see. Here's a photo of Satchel with Lefty Gomez. But anyway, I thought of the story and I thought, what an incredible time it would have been to be part of baseball. But I didn't know much about the time and how deep or far Feller's relationship with Satchel and other players went. And then your book comes along, Luke. Our Team, it's an incredible, touching novel, but it's also timely in the terms of racial relationships, sport, everything. And I want to know, how did this idea come about?
So this book is about four different individuals in the 1940s. It's mainly set in Cleveland because these individuals converge on the Cleveland Indians. I'm not from Cleveland. I have no connection to Cleveland. I'm not even an Indians fan. I'm from St. Louis. St. Louis in the 1940s and 50s used to have two Major League Baseball teams, the St. Louis Cardinals, who are still there, and the St. Louis Browns, who moved to Baltimore to become the Orioles. My grandfather was a fan of the St. Louis Browns. Anybody that knows anything about the St. Louis Browns probably knows about the team's last owner, a man named Bill Beck. He did some of his most notorious stunts on the St. Louis Browns. He brought a little person to the plate, Eddie Goodell. He had sort of fans managed from the grandstands. He would shoot off fireworks, give away sort of wild promotional events, have exploding scoreboards, the whole sort of works, all these sort of promotional things that Bill Beck invented. So I really latched onto him as a character, and I thought that I wanted to write about St. Louis, the Browns, Bill Beck. But when I started researching Beck, I realized that his most significant thing that he did was actually before he owned the Browns. The first Major League team he owned was the Cleveland Indians from 1946 to 1949. And there he integrated the Indians. He won a World Series championship in 1948, and he kind of set Cleveland on fire. He set all these attendance records across the board, everything that you can imagine. And so when I was sort of looking at his time in Cleveland, I saw several other names that kept coming to the forefront: Bob Feller, Larry Doby, Satchel Paige. And I looked at these four individuals who came together in Cleveland, and I thought to myself, here you have two white men, Bill Beck, a more sort of progressive individual, Bob Feller, a bit more of a traditionalist from rural America. Then you had two Black individuals, Larry Doby and Satchel Paige, 17 years apart in age. Satchel Paige was 42 on the Indians. Larry Doby was 24. And I thought to myself, they represented different generations of Negro League baseball and sort of the Black experience in athletics. So I thought you could have these four individuals tell a different integration story than the one that we normally hear about, which is about Jackie Robinson and Branch Rickey. But here was another integration story that was happening more or less at the same time.
It seems that it wasn't out in the forefront because everybody knows about Jackie, which is great. However, nobody knew about Larry Doby at all.
Yeah, they had very different experiences. Jackie Robinson was signed by the Brooklyn Dodgers in October of 1945. He was given an entire year in the minor leagues before he went to the Dodgers. He played in Montreal. And so that kind of gave him time to acclimate, time to get used to being in all white clubhouses, give his teammates time to sort of acclimate to this idea of integration that was happening at the time. Robinson was a bit older. He was 28 when he debuted on the Dodgers in 1947. And he was known to both black and white fans alike because he'd been a star halfback on the UCLA football team years earlier, to the point where he got national recognition for the feats that he'd done there. And so he was a known quantity to a lot of individuals, or at least he wasn't unknown. Larry Doby had a much different experience. This is a man from Paterson, New Jersey. He went to an integrated high school there, but then he went into the Negro Leagues, played for the Newark Eagles. Bill Veeck, whenever he wanted to integrate the Indians in 1947, did not think that players should go to the minor leagues for first to get seasoning there. He brought Doby directly from the Newark Eagles to the Cleveland Indians. Larry Doby played a game for the for the Eagles on July 4th, 1947, boarded a train, came to Chicago where the Indians were playing the White Sox, and the very next day he was in an Indians uniform. So Larry Doby, unlike Jackie Robinson, traveled literally overnight from the Negro to the major leagues. And it was a real shock to his system. He was much younger than Robinson. He was 23 when he debuted. He was unknown to pretty much everybody in white baseball. Nobody had ever heard of him. And he got a pretty chilly reception. So it was just a vastly different entrance to Major League Baseball than Robinson had.
So what was the thinking behind Beck in terms of this? I mean, he's throwing this kid into the fire right away.
Yeah, so when Bill Beck buys the Indians in 1946, they are a sixth place team. They are sort of perpetually behind powerhouses like the New York Yankees and the Boston Red Sox. Bill Beck grew up in Chicago. He knew the power of the Negro Leagues because the Negro Leagues were quite strong in Chicago. They had a number of great teams, but most importantly, they had the Negro League All-Star game that happened in Chicago that Beck attended. And so he knew the skills and abilities of the Negro Leagues. And he believed that if the Indians were to get out of their sixth place standings in 1946, they would need to sort of revamp the roster quickly and sort of bring in as many good players as possible. And he realized that he could do so by finding players from the Negro Leagues. He also sort of believed that the Negro Leagues, at least the superstars in there, had the training and the ability and the skills necessary to sort of transition into the major leagues. He didn't want to get somebody that he thought he could just sort of put into the minors and see what happens. He wanted to just kind of throw them right into the fire and just see how it works. He didn't want to give them time to sort of get into his head, think too much, think about integration. He wanted to just sort of happen really fast, almost like tearing off a Band-Aid. And besides, the Indians farm clubs were mainly in the South at that time. He did not want to send Larry Doby to the South where he would have had to face additional prejudices.
But it's funny that it seemed like his actions followed who he was as a person. If you could talk a little bit about Beck and what he was like, because he seemed like a guy who couldn't sit still.
Yeah, and in the book, I have him as a man in sort of constant motion. He is an extraordinary individual. He's born into baseball quite literally. His father was president of the Chicago Cubs. And so he grew up going to the stadium and sort of assisting his father and the Chicago Cubs organization in whatever he could do. By the time he's a teenager, he's already gained enough sort of baseball know-how and knowledge as men that are twice his age. So his father dies when he's quite young. He goes into the Cubs office and he's dissatisfied. He doesn't want to work under somebody. He is sort of a man who wants to be sort of free to do his own sorts of things. His father was an innovator in terms of sort of ladies' days and putting games on the radio and all of these things in the 1920s were really forward looking. But he was a dignified man. He wore suits all the time. He spoke very properly. Bill Veeck was quite the opposite. He never wore a suit. He never wore a tie. He never wore a hat. His hair was kind of frizzy and all over the place. He really sort of went against that sort of button down era of the time whenever people wore suits to go to baseball games. Bill Veeck was kind of more of a freewheeling, free thinking sort of individual. And one one of the ways that he was free thinking was that he believed that baseball with competitive play on the field could coexist with entertaining sideshows that happened in between innings or before games. And so he was one of the innovators in sort of putting bands on the field and shooting off fireworks and putting sort of stuntmen on the field and sort of doing all these sort of wild in-game publicity and promotions and things like that we now take for granted. If we go to a baseball game now, we're sort of used to t-shirt cannons and other sorts of things with the scoreboard. All of that was kind of invented out of whole cloth by Bill Beck. And so he's just a man who is sort of constantly experimenting, constantly thinking of ways that he can both improve the club and improve a fan's experience at a game. And so in terms of integration, at that time, the color line in Major League Baseball was nothing more than a gentleman's agreement. It was not codified in the baseball rule book. There was nothing that said a Major League team could not sign a black player, but there was a gentleman's agreement among the owners that they would not sign people of black African descent. Bill Beck had no use for gentleman's agreements. He was an owner that was going to throw that aside if it was going to help his club, and he was just going to sort of let things settle as they did. And so Bill Beck bringing Larry Doby directly from the Negro Leagues to the Major Leagues is very in keeping with his personality. He thought it was going to work. He wanted to experiment to see what happened, so he did it. And so it was a little bit rushed. It was a little bit sort of hasty. And ultimately, it wasn't perhaps the right decision because Larry Doby did struggle mightily in his first season. And he probably could have used that same sort of acclimation period that Jackie Robinson had in the minors. But that just simply was not Bill Beck's way of doing business.
Wow. And it's funny that Bill Beck, what Branch Rickey gets all the press and everything but bottom line is Branch Rickey was a businessman.
Yeah.
I mean, he was down with the cause somewhat, but he was really for the business. But however, Bill Beck was actually for integration for humanistic reasons as well, wasn't he?
Yeah, I mean, I think that Branch Rickey was to an extent. Rickey certainly did at numerous points of his life talk about the Christian principles that sort of led him to believe that segregation was wrong. But I think the sort of business-minded aspects of integration were more important to him. The Brooklyn Dodgers, by the time he took over the club in the mid-40s, were an aging team that were fading from pennant contention. And he sort of recognized that during the time, this was, of course, during World War II or right at the end of World War II. So a lot of Major League players were in the service. So he sort of recognized that if he wanted to improve the Dodgers, the quickest way to do so would be to sign players from the Negro Leagues. However, Rickey did not compensate owners of the Negro Leagues for black players that he signed. In fact, he didn't even contact the owners of these Negro League teams. He simply believed that the Negro Leagues were sort of an inferior league. He called them a racket at various points in his life. And he believed that the contracts that they signed would not sort of hold up the way that Major League contracts were signed. So he thought that at the end of every season, the Negro League players were essentially free agents. And so he didn't need to contact the owners. He could just sign whoever he wanted to in the offseason and put them on the Dodgers. The Negro League owners sort of recognized that if this was the pattern, that any Major League owner could just come and steal their players, then they weren't going to be in business very often because all their great players would just get signed away and they would get no compensation for them. Bill Beck, on the other hand, had much greater respect for the Negro Leagues. He was somebody who sort of had followed his entire life to the point that whenever he came to Cleveland, he talked to various reporters in the black press, and they talked about how they were impressed not only by the fact that Bill Beck knew who various players were, but he could tell you what positions they played. He could even give you statistics about certain players. He followed the Negro Leagues that closely. And so he sort of recognized that these owners deserve some sort of compensation for finding, developing these players. And so he established the precedent of contacting the Negro League owners and giving them money to sign players like Larry Doby and Satchel Paige. And Bill Beck himself was an actor. He was a member of the NAACP. Yes. He sort of fought for he sort of fought against segregation in residential areas in Cleveland. Gave speeches to sort of Black organizations and things like that. He really sort of believed in these principles.
And one of the owners he dealt with is quite incredible in her own right, was Effa Manley,
Yeah.
who was a female, and she was the only female owner, obviously, of that time. And if you could talk a little bit about Effa, because you wrote extensively about her.
Yeah, she's really amazing. Effa Manley was the co-owner of the Newark Eagles. Her and her husband, Abe, had bought the team in the mid-30s and ran it through the late 40s. But it was really Effa Manley who ran the club. Abe sort of supplied the money, and he traveled with the team, and he enjoyed being around baseball. But Effa was the one that was making the decisions, that was setting the schedules, that was talking to sort of all the sort of coordination that needed to go into making a Negro League schedule. She was quite a strong-willed individual. And despite the fact that a lot of owners in the Negro Leagues really thought that she had no business being in these sort of league meetings or, speaking to them as a peer, because they simply believed that a woman shouldn't be doing this kind of work. But Effa Manley was extremely strong-willed and would curse you out if you even tried to question what she was doing. But she was also a fierce advocate for her players. She was sort of very strict with how they dressed, with how they sort of held themselves, with how they presented themselves to the community. She was very big into sort of making the Newark Eagles a staple of northern New Jersey, and she was fierce too in terms of sort of giving them what they could want. I mean, she recruited Larry Doby out of high school and really kind of made him feel welcome on those teams. Larry Doby, in fact, when he was on the Indians in his first year or two, he would often tell reporters in the Black press that he wished he was still back with the Newark Eagles, because he felt much more camaraderie, much more companionship, and much more a sense of sort of team unity there. And I think a lot of that can be due to Effa Manley, who, in addition, was also extremely strong in making sure that she was compensated by Bill Beck for getting Larry Doby. She was just a woman who was ahead of her time in so many different ways.
And baseball finally recognized it decades later when she was inducted into the first woman inducted into the National Baseball Hall of Fame.
Very long overdue. She led that Newark Eagles club to a Negro League World Series championship in 1946. They had players on that team like Larry Doby, Monty Irving, Leon Day, Ray Dandridge, Willie Wells, Mule Suttles. All of these Hall of Famers came through the Newark Eagles. I mean, it was a real sort of breeding ground for incredible talent.
And I hear they're doing a limited television series about her coming up. That's after Penny Marshall was originally slated to direct a few years ago until she sadly passed away. But, A League of Her Own, Penny Marshall.
Yeah.
But now it looks like Effa's going to get her due, which is great. But I think what you did was incredible. What you wrote about her is just
Yeah, she had an amazing relationship with Larry Doby. And I had to stop myself from writing. My book is mainly about these four individuals: Doby, Page, Feller, and Beck. And I had to stop myself from sort of writing 50 pages about Effa Manley. She's just that interesting. So there actually have been a few good biographies about her. One that just came out this past year by a woman named Andrea Williams. So if anybody's interested in Effa Manley, that's a great biography to check out.
I will check that out. And you had mentioned the players. Who you want to talk about first? Larry Doby, Bob Feller, or Satchel Paige?
You can sort of talk about Feller and Page in the same breath. They sort of they're sort of reverse images of each other. Bob Feller has the most amazing athlete origin story that I think this country has ever known. He is somebody who grew up on a farm in central Iowa. His dad recognized from a very early age an extraordinary ability in his son. So whenever Bob Feller was about 11 or 12, they sort of mowed down a part of their farmland and built a baseball diamond right there. It was essentially the original Field of Dreams in
Field Dreams.
yeah, I mean, it really was. And so he used that sort of field. He was playing against men that were twice, sometimes three times his age, and developed this incredible pitching arsenal. He was throwing over 100 miles an hour by the time he was like 15 or 16. I mean, he was a legend
Wow.
in his time. By the time he's 17, he kind of makes it onto the Indians through happenstance. And in his very first ever major league start as a 17-year-old, he ties the American League record in strikeouts. 4 starts later, he ties the major league record in strikeout. He is such a phenomenon that when he comes back to Iowa as a 17-year-old kid, he makes it onto the cover of Time magazine. And then his high school graduation is broadcast live from coast to coast on the radio by NBC. I mean, he's the biggest athletic star of that time. And I think it's really because it's the Depression, and he represents something that Americans like to talk about themselves. He is the sort of American dream come to life. He's somebody that through hard work, farm work, strong family bonds with his father, sort of, all the good sort of wholesome values that we like to think about, pulled himself up supposedly by his bootstraps and made it from the cornfields to the major leagues. It is the story that Americans like to tell themselves. Now, the flip side of that story is someone like Satchel Paige, who grows up in the Deep South during a time of extreme segregation and Jim Crow. He too develops this sort of incredible fastball that everybody recognizes is one of the best ones. He makes it into the Negro Leagues whenever he's about 18 or 19, but he, doesn't have the advantages that Feller's sort of race affords him. He has to build himself up into what is essentially a one-man franchise. He, through sort of accomplishment, through his own personality, and through his demeanor, this sort of way that he sort of walked slowly to the mound with a deadpan face, and then would throw a ball that was the fastest that anybody had seen. It was breathtaking. People could not wait for him to take the mound. Just the mere sight of Satchel Paige coming out was enough to sort of send fans into a frenzy. So by the time the mid-30s came around, by the time Bob Feller is coming to Major League Baseball, Satchel Paige is already one of the biggest stars in all of baseball. He's a one-man franchise who barnstorms across the country. He plays on whatever team will sort of pay him enough money, and he pockets the gate receipts. He's making as much as any white superstar at that time. And he's playing in the Negro Leagues during a time whenever the Negro Leagues were suffering tremendously financially. So he is like, Satchel Paige and Bob Feller sort of established themselves as the premier white and black pitchers of that time.
Describe how he would pitch, because I mean, he would pitch 2 games a day sometimes, and they would go like, play 10 games in a week or so, wouldn't they?
Yeah, so the Negro Leagues at that time, they had what was known as league games, which is whenever Satchel Paige's main team, at times it was the Pittsburgh Crawfords, at times it was the Kansas City Monarchs, they would play against teams like the Newark Eagles or the Homestead Grays or teams like this. And that was known as sort of a league game. And so that counted in the standings and things like that. And so Paige would often sort of pitch complete games whenever that was happening. That's when he would really bear down. But then after that game was done, Negro League teams, to make money, to sort of, to hold the finances together, often sort of would then go and play in smaller towns like nearby or across the country the next day or the day after that, against semi-pro teams or factory teams or farm teams or whomever would sort of pay them the money to do that. And Satchel Paige was so well known that sometimes the teams would just say, we just want Satchel to come and pitch 3 innings for us. And so he'd pitch a game against the Grays, get into his car, drive all night, go into this town, suit up on a team with people he didn't even know who they were, and sort of pitch against these semi-pro clubs. And, would throw 3 innings, pocket the gate receipts, and then go on to wherever else he was going to after that. And so he would throw, a couple games a week, not all the time going 9 innings, sometimes just going a couple of innings. But that is how he both made his money and sort of burnished his legend.
Wow. And Bob Feller had a similar path. I mean, was 1946, he had 36 complete games. Started 42, relieved 6.
Yeah.
which is amazing. The complete games themselves is amazing because the entire major leagues in 2019 only pitched 45
Yeah.
complete games.
Yeah.
So here's one guy throwing 36 complete games, throwing 340 something strikeouts.
Yeah.
But then he's also, yeah, go ahead.
Bob Feller, he was somebody that by the time that the World War II came around, he was 22 years old. He'd already won 100 games in the majors, and he already had 1,000 strikeouts. There was sort of this idea that this kid was going to set all of the major league pitching records. He was that good. But then the war comes, and he immediately enlists. He kind of feels his duty to go into the war. So he misses like 3 to 4 years of major league seasons. And so there goes any chance he has of setting major league records. So when he comes back from the war in 1946, he's determined to make up for lost time, both on the field, as you said, sort of showing all those complete games, getting all those strikeouts, throwing all those innings, and in his pocketbook, because he lost a lot of money going to war. And so he starts doing these things where he's developing these large barnstorming tours. Barnstorming at that time, a lot of white players after the major league season ended, so this would be in like October, would, before the weather turned a little bit too cold for this, would sort of go around the country to sort of towns that didn't have major league teams like Columbus or Indianapolis or, you know, wherever, Kansas City, and play barnstorming games. These were exhibition games. They didn't count for any sort of standing, but they sort of got a cut of the gate, and it sort of gave them an extra paycheck before the winter came. And because these were not major league games, they could play against competition like the Negro Leagues. So it was one of the few times that white players and white major league players faced black Negro League players. And so Bob Feller was one of the preeminent barnstormers of the time. And he would always want to get paired up with the best counterpart that he could, not only so that the crowd had a good competition, but so that they could make more money. Like if they could bill it as Bob Feller versus Satchel Paige, a lot of white fans would come and a lot of black fans would come, and then they all make the money. And so in 1946, he does this barnstorming tour where he wants to sort of rent out airplanes and rent out stadiums and go from one coast to the other, all the way across the country, every single day having a game. So they would start in Boston, the next day they would go to New York, the next day to Newark, next day to Philly, so on and so on and so on.
Oh my gosh.
Sometimes they played 2 games in one day. They would play an afternoon game, get into a bus, drive through the day, play a night game, get onto a plane. It was just kind of this marathon thing. And every day Bob Feller faced off against Satchel Paige. They just went mano a mano for like a full month there. In fact, for the program that you have in the back, that was that tour. And so it was sort of some of the best major leaguers, some of the best Negro League players. And the tour was important not only because it made them a lot of money, but because it was at a time whenever integration was just happening. Jackie Robinson had been signed, integration was in the air. And so this tour drew so many fans, 250,000 in total, and a lot of white executives went to see it as well. And so they were seeing black stars that they might not have seen otherwise. And they were seeing that these black stars were not just performers or clowns. You know, a lot of white players thought they were clowns. They were legit superstars that could beat Bob Feller on any given day. And so it was really through that tour that Satchel Paige himself showed that he still had what it took to be in the majors.
And that's what Beck saw then.
Yeah. Whenever Bill Veeck was about to sign Satchel Paige in 1948, one of the first people he went to was Bob Feller and said, "Hey, you've been playing against him. Does he still have it?" And Feller just immediately was like, "Oh yeah, he definitely does." And it was through those tours that Beck knew he could trust him.
I have to make an aside here about Bob Feller. He won 266 games, yet he lost almost 4 full seasons to the war. Plus, he was kind of a war hero. And, you know, I love the fact that you wrote that he really wanted to be on the USS Iowa, the battleship, as opposed to the Alabama, which he was at. But I guess there was a waiting list for all the Iowans who wanted to be on the USS Iowa or something like that.
Yeah, well, Bob Feller, when he went to the war, he was winning 25 games consistently per season. And so you figure that he went to war when he was like 23, 24, 25, et cetera. I mean, that's another sort of 75 to 100 wins that he could have gotten right there. So he had 266 wins for his career. But I mean, you have to say conservatively that if the war hadn't happened, he would have had at least 325, probably more.
Okay. I have to ask though, after that year he had 1946 with the innings, the game, complete games, the barnstorming, did that take something out of him eventually, do you
Oh
think?
yeah, definitely. In 1947, you can read it, sort of newspaper accounts. People said that his fastball just wasn't where it was the season before. He threw 373 innings in 1946, which is a number that no major leaguer has really even come close to since then. And then after that, he barnstormed Satchel Paige for an entire month, pitching every single day. And so you have to imagine that, like, your arm just can't take all that wear and tear. He does get injured in 1947. He falls off the mound, sort of tears some muscles in his pitching arm, and he tries to pitch through it, and he really shouldn't have. But he really isn't the same pitcher after 1946. And he himself admits that he used to just sort of be able to rely on that 100+ mile-an-hour fastball. But after that, he had to learn how to throw the slider more. He just had to become a different pitcher.
And I'm sure he realized his chances of getting World Series championship are lessening. So we jump ahead to 1948, and Beck creates his team. He drafts Dovey, and he also had an issue with his shortstop player manager Lou Boudreau, because Lou Boudreau wasn't doing a great job, and he gave him an ultimatum of sorts, didn't he?
Yeah, Luke Boudreau is also another interesting character that could have been a sort of main figure of my book. He is somebody who comes to the Indians in his early 20s. He'd been a captain of various teams in college at the University of Illinois. And so he had this sort of leadership quality that he cultivated from a very young age. The Indians were just kind of in disarray. They had gone through a series of managers. Nothing was working. And Boudreau in 1942 just said, well, why don't I be manager? He was their shortstop. He was 24 years old. And the Indians front office is like, well, nothing else is working. Why not? And so he becomes the player manager at age 24. And so whenever Beck kind of buys the team in 1946, he doesn't look well on that situation. He thinks that Lou Boudreau is a fantastic shortstop, which he was. But he kind of looks at Lou Boudreau as a manager and is like, he's a little overwhelmed with his playing duties, and he's not very strategic. Lou Boudreau always managed from his gut. Like, if you asked him why he made a certain decision, why did you pinch hit this person? Why did you substitute that person? He would just say, well, that's just what I felt. And it was just kind of like Beck wanted somebody that was a little bit more analytically minded. And so he did everything he could to convince Boudreau to step down as manager and just be the shortstop. But Boudreau was hard-headed, and he said, look, if I'm not going to be the manager, then I will not be the shortstop, and you will have to trade me.
Smart.
So Bill Beck basically tried to do that in 1947, but the entire city of Cleveland revolted and basically told Beck, if you trade Boudreau, then, we're not going to come see the team. And so Beck had to kind of relent. It's like the city of Cleveland, overruled him in a way. And so in 1948, whenever they came into spring training, it was Boudreau. It was make or break. He had to get the Indians at least into second or third place. And it really seemed unlikely. The Indians had finished in fourth in 1947. And it was kind of like, well, how are they going to make it to the World Series?
Well, I would wonder how they, if I were a sports fan at the time, I would wonder how they'd make it out of the second division.
Yeah.
They had a lot of questions, including, we go back to Larry Doby, and he was essentially hidden on his team in 1947, and they're just going to throw him to the Lions. Yet he responded. How did he respond?
It's a tremendous story. I mean, we talked about Bob Feller's origin story, and I think this Larry Doby story is equally as improbable and amazing. In 1947, when he comes onto the Indians with no sort of acclimation period or nothing, the team treats him really kind of coldly, and he doesn't get a lot of at-bats. In fact, he only comes to the plate 30-something times. He gets 5 hits. He does not look like a major league star. He's nervous. He says that his teeth are chattering when he comes to bat because the pressure is just so great. And he's extremely isolated. There, at that time, he wasn't allowed to stay in the same hotels as the Indians in certain cities. And even whenever he could stay in the same hotel, he roomed alone. At that time, baseball players roomed with another player, but there wasn't a practice of a white player rooming with a black player. And since there were no other black players on the Indians, Larry Doby roomed by himself. And sort of the isolation, and the loneliness, and just the sort of alienation and prejudices as he was facing kind of made him struggle on the baseball field for the first time ever in his life. So when he comes back in 1948, the Indians really don't think he's even going to make the team. They think he's going to be sent to the minors or even cut because he looks overmatched. But he comes into spring training and just starts tearing the cover off the ball. Just amazing turnaround. It's like he kind of remembers who he was as a player, and he has a sort of spring training away from the fans and away from the pressures to sort of rediscover himself on the baseball field. Has such an amazing spring training that they not only keep him, but they shift him into the outfield and allow him to start. And so he makes the team just amazingly. And really, without Doby on the team that year, the Indians would not have come close to being a World Series champion.
You know, it strikes me, I think it feels like he had a tougher road than Robinson. I mean, from the time he was introduced to his team, you know, Jackie had all the fanfare and being the first, but being the second guy, it just seemed like his road was tougher.
Well, if you think about Jackie Robinson is in New York City, he's in Brooklyn. So this is the media capital of the country. He is the first, he's the pioneer, he's getting all of the credit, and he is known. And so the press already sort of knows how to write about him, knows a little bit about his background, things like that. And so everything he's doing that first year that he's in the majors is being documented by the press, which in some ways sort of, you know, it doesn't comfort him and it doesn't make it any easier, but it does provide a little bit of protection for anybody to do anything particularly egregious to him because it's going to be reported. He's one of the most tracked individuals in the country. Larry Doby, on the other hand, is in Cleveland, which is far from the media capital, and he's not playing very much, unlike Jackie Robinson, who was a starter. And so the press is kind of in Cleveland for like a week or two when Doby first comes in there as the first player in the American League. And then they just leave because Doby's not playing. It doesn't look like he's very good. And so all of the sort of abuse and prejudices that Robinson is suffering, Doby is also suffering, but he's doing it much more in solitude and by himself.
But he did have a little bit of help in a Hall of Famer in the outfield, Tris Speaker.
Yeah, he did. Tris Speaker was the Indians' center fielder on their 1920 World Series championship team. Bill Beck hired him as a coach, and Speaker comes from Texas. And there was sort of questions about whether Speaker had ever been a member of the Ku Klux Klan. In any way, he grew up in a much more sort of prejudiced background, but he put all that aside when he saw Larry Doby in spring training of 1948. He would later tell the press that he used to dream about somebody with Doby's talent coming onto the Indians. Like he just recognized it in Doby. Doby had everything you could want: the speed, the power, the batting eye, the throwing arm. It was the entire package. And so any sort of prejudices that Speaker might have carried from his childhood melted away, and he really helped Doby.
And we get back to the pitchers a little bit, Feller and Satchel.
Yeah.
They seem to, throughout that year, I mean, it's no secret in your book, we're not giving it away, they won the World Series, which makes it all the more remarkable because neither of these guys had great seasons that year. But they also, when one was doing well, the other one was not doing well, and then vice versa. They're like mirror images of each other, as you said.
Yeah, they really are. They're sort of tied. They're sort of tied to an invisible pulley or something like that. So basically, Bob Feller has he really struggles that season, and he's not doing as well as people thought he could be doing. I think that by the All-Star break, he is below 500, and so Bill Beck is kind of panicked. Beck is saying to himself, we're finally sort of showing promise, and maybe we could get past the Yankees and the Red Sox, but Feller is not pitching up to speed. And so he sort of wants to reinforce the pitching staff. And so he goes to looking for other pitchers, and that's when he decides to bring in Satchel Paige. It's really because of Feller's struggles that Beck is sort of panicked enough to look for outside help. And so when Paige comes onto the Indians, it sort of sparks a mania across the league. Even if white fans had not seen Satchel Paige or had never even seen a Negro League game, they'd likely heard of him. His legend had crossed into the mainstream media. He'd had features in the Saturday Evening Post and Time Magazine and the New York Times. He was a known quantity. And so white fans in particular were coming out to sort of see who this person was. And black fans, of course, were just so excited to see him in the Negro Leagues. He was setting attendance records every time he pitched. And he was also pitching incredibly well for a couple of months at a time when Bob Feller was not pitching well. And so, yeah, there was a sort of like, if Feller was well, Paige was here. If Paige was well, Feller was here. It was an amazing symmetry.
And they were doing this in a stadium that was 72,000 people, which is unheard of. I mean, you get stadiums now 35, 40,000. And
yeah,
the following, I couldn't believe the following that this team generated. It must have been a really crazy time to be part of the Indians.
Yeah, Cleveland had built a municipal stadium that they would hope would sort of attract things like the Olympics or other sort of big events. And so they built this gigantic, almost like Coliseum-like stadium, and it seated 78,000 people. And they wanted the Indians to move into there. But it was kind of embarrassing because whenever the Indians first moved into that stadium, they were only drawing 5,000 to 10,000 people, which was about standard for some baseball games at that time. But it made it look like there was nobody there because the stadium was so huge. And so Bill Beck, rather than being discouraged by this when he came to the Indians, was like, I could fill this thing. I know I can. And so he set about sort of like bringing the fans there, doing everything he could, exploding fireworks, sort of getting clowns onto the field, you know, rebuilding the roster, integrating all of these sorts of things.
Yeah.
So that by the time 1948 came around, there were games whenever sports writers were saying that the stadium was too small, that it couldn't fit. You know, we were getting like 80,000 people coming to these games. And so it was just amazing. I mean, in the World Series in particular, like 85,000 people were coming. So it was kind of it was just a magical year for
wow. It was. I mean, everything seemed to come together with Boudreaux. Didn't he hit something like 350 or something crazy like that?
No.
He was the MVP that year, wasn't he?
He was the MVP that year. Yeah, Larry Doby comes out of nowhere, bats over 300. Bob Lemon, who was their other star pitcher, he used to be an infielder and he converted to a pitcher just 2 years earlier, comes out of nowhere, wins 20 games. They also had a knuckleballer named Gene Bearden, who had been severely injured in the war, could barely lift his leg above his hip, and wins 20 games that year. Never again sort of approaches those numbers. It just seemed like every single thing was going right, including Satchel Paige. Like a lot of people thought that Beck was crazy when he signed Satchel Paige because Paige was 42 years old. People thought he was way too old and that he couldn't survive in the major leagues. And Paige wins 6 games. And those are 6 crucial games. The Indians tie the Red Sox at the end of the season for the record. So for the best record in the American League. So you take away any of those wins by Satchel Paige and the Indians don't make it to the World Series.
How old was Satchel Paige then?
Well, that was kind of the $1 million question in 1948. A lot of people thought that he was in his late 40s. Some people thought he was in his 50s. You even saw newspaper reports that he was in his 60s. There was even a contest that was devised where Satchel Paige claimed that he was only about 40. And he said that he started pitching in 1927. So he said, I will give $100, which at that time was a lot of money, to anybody who can show me a box score of me pitching before 1927. And so, of course, everybody across the country ran to their libraries and tried to find something. And someone did. Satchel Paige had pitched in 1926. And so, you know, nobody knew how old he was, and they loved to play this up. You know, stories were written about, you know, that he was possibly 50 or ageless or something. But I think we know pretty well now that he was 42 years old. There were records that his family kept that came to light a little bit later. And so
Okay.
when Beck signed him, he was 42.
But Beck signed him later on too, when he was 57.
Beck signed him when he was Beck then owned the St. Louis Browns, which is the team I originally wanted to write about. And he brought over Page, and Page pitched there till he was 47. And then Beck owned sort of co-owned a minor league team in Miami, and Page pitched for them for a while. And then in 1960, was it 5? For the Oakland Athletics, or the Kansas City Athletics, I'm sorry, they were still in Kansas City. They signed Satchel Paige for a one-day contract as kind of a stunt to come out at the end of the year and pitch against the Red Sox. It was a real game, and they just thought, it was something to draw the fans. The Kansas City Athletics were not in the pennant chase, so they thought, oh, this would be a good event. Paige shocked everybody by blowing through the lineup. I mean, I think he was like 59 years old. And he was still just mowing down MLB batters. He was just somebody who, his autobiography was titled "Maybe I'll Pitch Forever." And I think that if he were still alive, he'd be 120. But if he were still alive, he'd still probably try to be pitching.
So why didn't they become a dynasty?
They were an old team. Lou Boudreau had his last really great season that year. He was on the wrong side of 30. Bob Feller had just turned 30. Satchel Paige, of course, was 42. And so it just seemed like all of the breaks that they got in 1948 suddenly came back to bite them in 1949. I mean, 1948 was just one of those seasons. I didn't put this in the book, but there was a newspaper report that said that everything was going Bill Veeck's way, so much so that Bill Veeck was a man who was losing his hair. And so he used to sort of put his hand through his hair, sort of twist it, and look at the strands that came out, and he'd be like, you know what? I think it's coming back. I think it's coming back. And of course it wasn't, but that was his sort of attitude that year. It was just like, everything is going so well that even my hair is going to go back. It was just one of those magical years that you simply could not recreate. And in fact, the Indians have never recreated it. That was the last pennant team that the Indians had ever had. And the Indians drew so many fans that year that they would not beat that attendance record for fans until the 90s, when they moved into a new stadium. So it was just it was a year that can't be recreated.
You wrote in your title, the title says they changed baseball. If anybody has any questions, feel free to type in right now, but how did the Indians change baseball in your eyes?
Well, I think that the way that they changed baseball was that they gave Bill Veeck's Indians gave other owners across the league a blueprint for how integration could work. Whenever Jackie Robinson, at the end of 1947, was the sort of only Black player from that year in the major leagues to have had a good season, a lot of people that were skeptical of integration remained skeptical of integration, because they said, well, look, they brought in Doby, they brought in some other players on the Dodgers, they brought in some players on the St. Louis Browns. None of them worked out. Only Jackie Robinson worked. So Jackie Robinson was kind of thought of as an exceptional figure, a unique figure, somebody that was perhaps the lone person that could withstand the pressures of Major League Baseball. But then what happened in 1948 was you had someone like Larry Doby, who'd looked so lost and unprepared the year before, burst out of nowhere and hit 300 and be really the spark plug that got the Indians into the World Series. Like, the difference between the Indians, the Red Sox, and the Yankees that year was the fact that the Indians had integrated. If the Red Sox or the Yankees had integrated, perhaps they too would have had a competitive advantage, but they didn't. And the Indians gave themselves that competitive advantage by adding Larry Doby, by adding Satchel Paige. And then in the World Series, Larry Doby led all Indians batters with a .318 batting average. So much so that at the end, the Boston Braves, whom the Indians had just beat in the World Series, the owner of that team basically said, you know what? Next year, whenever we go to spring training, I'm going to have several Negro League players come out for tryouts, because we cannot continue to give up this advantage to the Indians. They sort of realized that what gave Beck that sort of leap was the fact that they had integrated. And if they had not done that, they wouldn't have been anywhere near the World Series. So it was definitely a blueprint that Beck was giving, that if you want to take that next leap to sort of get past, the hump that we're over, the solution was simple: just integrate your rosters. And so it seemed like at the end of that season, a lot of owners and the press were coming to that conclusion, that this is what needed to happen. Of course, it took Major League Baseball quite a long time after that for all the teams to integrate. It did not happen as quickly as Beck predicted and that everyone thought it was going to, but it certainly gave the blueprint to follow for how that could work.
Which led to the Red Sox not integrating until 1959 with Pumpsie Green, as opposed to signing Roberto Clemente when they could have signed Roberto Clemente.
1959 was Larry Doby's last year in the league. And
That's right.
Yeah, it took that long for the Red Sox to finally integrate.
Wow. The story about the Braves manager and ownership calls to mind Bear Bryant and when he scheduled USC and Sam Cunningham to play, because he wanted to show that Black players, the future is with Black players. And I'm glad that you were able to tribute Larry Doby, because he's a player that long has not got his due. He's been in the Hall of Fame, 7-time All-Star, deservedly so, but he hasn't gotten his due. And I really appreciate the fact that you gave him his due tonight.
Yeah, I think that like Jackie Robinson, the way that we remember integration now is often just about the story of Jackie Robinson. Major League Baseball celebrates Jackie Robinson Day, as I think they definitely should. I mean, it's rightfully so. But by only sort of celebrating one individual, you sort of then obscure a lot of the people that followed directly in his footsteps. It wasn't like Larry Doby came in a year after Robinson. He was there weeks after Robinson was there. And so now you just kind of, think about Larry Doby as the answer to a trivia question: who was the second Black player in the major leagues? As opposed to somebody who had a story that was as meaningful and as significant as Jackie Robinson's story. And so what I kind of wanted to do with this book was not only to sort of, give Doby his due, but show how exciting that story was, like sort of recapture that narrative, and how at the time in 1948, a lot of people thought that Robinson's story was as significant as Doby's story was as significant as Robinson's. And we sort of lost that in the, historic, as the years went by.
So Chris wanted to know, is Bill Beck a major league owner prior to Commissioner Happy Chandler taking over in 1945? We know integration had to wait until the passing of Judge Kennesaw Mountain Landis, the commissioner, for over 20 years.
Yeah, so that's an interesting question, and I kind of go into it in the book, because Bill Beck was the owner of a minor league team called the Milwaukee Brewers. The Brewers at this time were a minor league team. He bought the team in 1942. Or 41 or 42, I can't remember which one. But anyway, after the 1942 season, the Philadelphia Phillies in the major leagues come onto the market. And Bill Beck has this plan that he's going to buy the Phillies, which were a terrible last place team, and sort of stock the roster with players from the Negro leagues. And this is at a time when Judge Kennesaw Mountain Landis is still the baseball commissioner. Landis was somebody who really policed the color line. He was somebody who said in public that, the color line doesn't exist. Anybody can sign any Black player that they want to, but in private, anytime anybody even sort of made a gesture towards wanting to do that, he would sort of call into his office and talk them down. Apparently, Bill Beck told Kennesaw Mountain Landis, who he knew as a friend through his father, growing up in Chicago, that he planned to buy the Phillies and stock them with Negro League players. Landis then apparently steered the Phillies away from Beck's ownership group and gave them to another individual. And Beck would always claim throughout the rest of his life that it was really Landis who thwarted him from buying the Phillies. And so, it remains to be, who knows what would have happened if Landis hadn't died in 1944. But by the time Bill Beck buys the Indians in 1946, Happy Chandler is the commissioner, and he has a much more sort of open mind about integration.
Interesting. Good question, Chris. You had said before we went on, we'll close a little bit with this. Bobby Knight, you sent Bobby Knight a book and he loved it. What
Yeah.
about the families of the Fellers, the Dobies, and the Pages or the Vecks? Have they read the book and have you been approached by them?
Yeah, it is kind of unfortunate that nearly everybody in this book, because it takes place 75 years ago, most of the principal participants have passed away. There's only one person from the 1948 Indians who's still alive. That was the first baseman, Eddie Robinson. He is now 100 years old. He lives in Texas. I went and spent a weekend with him. He still has a memory that is as sharp as it was. He could recall specific games, specific pitches from the 1948 season. It was a real amazing thing that he's still with us. But I did have to rely on the families a lot for the other memories. I talked to the children of all the participants, Dobie, Page, Feller, and Beck. And I talked to Feller's wife, who I think actually just passed away a month ago. I know that the Dobies and the Vecks have it. I have not really heard from them yet. I did hear from Feller's family, and there's been a lot written about Feller. There's been, biographies and other sorts of things. But his son told me that he thought that this was the best thing ever written about his dad. So that was a real nice thing to hear from him. So yeah, I mean, I hope they like it. The book is really meant to sort of honor their stories and sort of recapture that incredible time. So I hope I did it well.
I think you did very well. And what I think you did best was capture the magic of that year, because it was really an incredible season from an unlikely team. And it was unlikely how they were put together.
Yeah.
I just think, yeah.
They really look different than any other major league team at that time. I mean, it's such a cool, quirky team, and it's just unfortunate that it's been a little bit lost. So I'm happy to bring them back.
Do you feel? I guess you could feel proud about something like this because it's a really great book.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, no, it's. I feel like it does what I wanted it to do. I wanted to tell an exciting story. I wanted it to almost read like a novel, like a page turner, and so even people that aren't necessarily baseball fans could read this and sort of get a slice of Americana at that time. So yeah.
Well, Luke, thank you for writing Our Team, the epic story of four men in the World Series that changed baseball. Please, out there, purchase this book if you haven't seen it, if you haven't read it yet. And Luke, I look forward to the next work, whatever that may be. Great. Thank you for joining us.
No, thank you for having me.
Have a nice evening. Good night.
Night.